Hello, English 200. Welcome to Detective Fiction and our first lecture tonight. I'll try not to go on too long. Let's get, yeah. So we'll get into it. Detective fiction has its roots in related genres. So particularly true crime, gothic, and mystery stories, but there are some differences that set it apart. Apart from the obvious difference of true crime being factual, true crime was often presented as sensational, focusing on criminal deviance and violence. So think about stories like, consider things like Jack the Ripper stories, other kinds of, or even like, not that it was I guess it was crime, but like Robin Hood stories, the idea where the wanted poster, like the criminal was the focus and was the star really of the show. So detective fiction veered away from that a little bit. Um, Gothic literature has several identifying elements, including seemingly supernatural events, uncanny moments, and a dark tone that produces a feeling of dread, and it skews more toward romance and horror. So Frankenstein is a work of Gothic fiction. Jane Eyre is a work of Gothic fiction. They have things going on that sort of push against the boundaries of scientific knowledge. And mystery stories don't necessarily have a detective figure, amateur or otherwise. They sometimes allow for supernatural elements as well. So that makes a difference. Um, This is Google Ngram, which is a tool that lets you track the appearance of a word in a big corpus of literature. This is actually kind of like an AI-driven program, an old one, right? Where Google scanned lots and lots of texts over a couple hundred years since the invention of the printing press, and news items and nonfiction pieces and fiction pieces, and it kind of tracks the appearance of a word. So you can see that a search for detective shows it beginning to turn up around 1850, right? 1849. And it rises steadily to a high point in the 1930s, and then it spikes again in the early 2000s. And this chart defines the three eras that we will look at in this course. The classical, which starts in the 1800s, in the mid to late 1800s, and carries through to about 1910, maybe. And then the hard-boiled, which picks up in the 1920s and goes all the way through the 1950s, and then the contemporary, which is sort of 19, you get hard-boiled pushing forward into the 70s, but contemporary around the 2000s, where we're starting to get into procedural teams of crime solvers. And who knows what this 1650 blip of detectives is about. So this first week is about writers of the Golden Age or the classical era of detective fiction. Edgar Allan Poe is considered the inventor of detective story, even though he only wrote three, and all of them feature C. Auguste Dupin, which is the main character in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is what we are going to read. That was his first one, and it set the template for what we think of as this sort of genius detective. And then The Mystery of Marie Roget, which is a little longer, it's a novella, and The Purloined Letter. Of these three, The Purloined Letter is actually my favorite, but for the purposes of this course, it's interesting to read the first one. When you read that story, you'll notice that it has a little recap at the beginning of every chapter, and that's because these stories were published in a serial fashion once per magazine, right? And so people would read them the way we watch television, right? When it comes on only once a week, the way we keep up with the pit or something. That's how people would read these stories. And you've probably read some Edgar Allan Poe. When you think about the origin of detective fiction or the crossover between things like true crime and gothic, Edgar Allan Poe definitely draws on those traditions. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he was a trained physician. He was known for creating Sherlock Holmes, and he really wasn't happy about it. He wanted to be taken seriously as an author of literary fiction, and Sherlock Holmes was so popular, it got away from him. The very first story, Sherlock Holmes story, is A Study in Scarlet. And if you were to read A Study in Scarlet, then you would see a lot of the same kind of um, elements that you see in C. Auguste Dupin. Sherlock Holmes is so famous sort of in pop culture that I imagine you'll recognize them in Dupin. Um, and yeah, so you'll see that as you read it. Studying Scarlet's quite long and it's quite weird. If you ever read it, the whole first half of the novella is solving a mystery. And the second half of the novella, or at least introducing the mystery, and the second half of the novella is almost a Western. It's set in Utah and it's about Mormons. So very strange and interesting. It's a little longer than the things I've assigned for this class. And so we're going to read a story called The Speckled Band, which is it is actually one of my favorite Holmes stories. And some unusual things happen in it that I think are worth drawing attention to. Conan Doyle killed off Holmes in The Final Problem in 1893, and then they resurrected him for The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1901 and published his last Holmes story in 1927. Hound of the Baskervilles is one of my favorites, and I love the film adaptation with Basil Rathbone. It was maybe my first introduction to Sherlock Holmes. I think I saw that black and white movie before I read them all as a kid. Um, very good, very mysterious. I think too, like when Sherlock Holmes was killed off in The Final Problem, there was mourning and there were people wore black and had funeral processions in the streets of London. And they wrote lots of angry letters trying to get him to bring him back to life. And those angry letters, in conjunction with a terrible financial situation, led him to bring Sherlock Holmes back so that he could make money. He was not pleased about it, though. Here's a famous line. An American playwright in the 1890s asked if he could use Sherlock Holmes for for a stage play. And Conan Doyle wrote, murder him, marry him, do whatever you want with him. The playwright had wanted to marry Sherlock Holmes off to somebody. And so Conan Doyle did not care. Agatha Christie. She was best known for her detectives Hercule Poirot, introduced in The Mysterious Affair at Styles in 1920, and Miss Marple, who first appears in The 13 Problems in 1927. You've probably seen Agatha Christie, the new Kenneth Branagh movies. Murder on the Orient Express is Agatha Christie, and then There Were None, Death on the Nile. These are all Agatha Christie mysteries. They're often taught in high schools. They're often adapted as plays, both in high school and um, in professional theater circles. I think her play The Mousetrap has been running on Broadway. It was maybe the longest running show on Broadway. It may not be on anymore, but it was as recently as 4 years ago when I was there. So Agatha Christie is sort of what we think about when we think of cozy mysteries, maybe. So that's, you know, good to bear in mind as you go. She disappeared for 11 days in 1926 and never explained what happened. And I've linked on the day for Agatha Christie, the drunk history, Kirsten Dunst's drunk history rendition of that, which you should check out if you have a few minutes. Dorothy Sayers is best known for her amateur detective Lord Peter Wimsey. He's an English aristocrat who first appeared in Whose Body in 1923. The Lord Peter Wimsey stories are set between the First and Second World Wars. The Sayers story is probably the one out of all of the classical ones we read that kind of throws people the most. I think Lord Peter Wimsey being an aristocrat is a little different from Miss Marple and Sherlock Holmes and Dupin, even though they're all kind of considered to be upper class educated people. It's not quite the same as a lord. Sometimes that distinction is lost on contemporary readers or American readers. Um, he's also a veteran of World War One, and he carries PTSD, which comes up a little bit in some of his stories. So he's an interesting and a different sort of character. I'll be curious to see how what you make of her story. Some things to think about. The classical era has a particular feel to it. So as you read these stories, make notes about what that feeling is and what produces it. In many ways, a close reading is a kind of detective work, identifying small clues, conducting research, and drawing conclusions. The point of these stories is when you as you read them is to sort of think about what is it that bothers you, what is it that confuses you. Those are good places to start for a close reading. If it bothers you, it's worth digging into whether the author meant to bother you or whether you think it's because of a difference in time period. And if it confuses you, again, it's worth thinking, is this deliberate on the author's part? Are they confusing me so that I don't guess who did it? Are they confusing me because they wrote in 1910 and I'm operating in 2026? Like those moments of confusion, and those moments of, you know, that little bit of friction between maybe what you're supposed to understand and what you do, are great places for close reading. There are other authors we could include in our study of the Golden Age, especially if we expanded to include novels. Wilkie Collins would certainly be on the reading list. He's considered the writer of the first novel. Edgar Allan Poe wrote the first detective short story, but The Moonstone is considered the first detective novel. Um, and it does some super weird things to make that happen. Um, Maybe Charles Dickens, G.K. Chesterton, Ellery Queen, and Guy Marsh, just to name a few. In other words, there's more to read if you're interested. If you like the Golden Age, there's tons out there. And we should take these authors as the tip of the iceberg. They don't represent the full breadth of classic age fiction, but they are the ones who poked through the surface and got popular enough that they've really set the tone for what we think of when we think of the Golden Era or the Golden Age. Another advantage is that these writers' works have been widely adapted. So as you think toward your final paper, you could conduct an analysis comparing one of the originals to a screen adaptation. So thinking about what does it mean to um, read something like Death on the Nile and then watch the recent interpretation, and what do we notice gets changed and why do we think it gets changed? Those are all good topics for the final paper. So yeah, let's see. Do I have any? The Padlet intros are looking great. I'm really enjoying the pictures. It's awesome to see all the different interests and recommendations. I'm building out my rec list for the summer, and I'll go through and like react with the heart once I have it in the grade book. I tried to fix all the links over the weekend so that nothing goes to a dead link, but I know the Zoom link was off a little bit when I started this evening and I went and replaced it real quick. But if you couldn't join tonight because of the Zoom link, I apologize. It's fixed now and I'll fix it in future. Although you're not required to do these, you can just watch them on um, I'll link them afterwards. And if you do watch them and you need the closed caption, I wait for YouTube to generate captions on it. So you should have closed captioning for it. Any other advice? I think one of the things that I added in a note here is to please avoid using AI to make your posts. One of the things that happens, one of the ways that the way that AI, that ChatGPT or AI generated language works from those large language models is that it assigns every word a token. And when you put in a question, it generates tokens that most often appear next to each other. Like it doesn't really understand what it's saying. It just puts the words that most commonly appear next to each other next to each other. And that's a problem for two reasons. One is that some of the stories I've chosen are a little off the beaten path. So if you don't do a lot of work to make sure it's paying attention to the particular story, copying my prompt in there is not going to give you a good answer. Um, and the other is that it tends to produce a really generic answer. It produces the answer that would most frequently have words appearing next to each other in that way. And when 35 students paste the same prompt into an AI generator, then it produces 35 answers that look identical. Um, my goal in this class is the things we're reading are not necessarily easy to understand. They're not, especially this first batch, but really I'm not sure that it gets much better as we go on. It's not necessarily easy to understand. It's okay to struggle with the language or the format or even the clues and what they're supposed to be. For me, like the struggle is the interesting part. The things that enrage you or upset you or confuse you, those are the things to write about. Those are the opportunities for us to make new knowledge, to have a new perspective on something that maybe has not been addressed before. So it's okay to do that. I don't know how clear it is. Maybe it depends on how carefully you read. When you make a post in your discussion groups, you can either post or you can reply. And you can do both if you want to. You're not required to reply, but if you do reply in a substantial way and not just, I agree with you or I like your point, but if you have an actual conversation to kind of build with somebody, it's okay for your post to be a reply post instead of an original post, if that makes sense. Um, so yeah, I think that'll be enough to get us started. If you have questions or you want to chat about something, then you can email, and I'm happy to answer. I'll be around. If it's urgent, you can text me. My cell phone number is on the syllabus. Please do go through the syllabus and the schedule and let me know if there are things links that are broken or things that aren't clear. I'm happy to clear that up. And I will open the Zoom meeting again next week, next Tuesday at this time to talk about the hard-boiled era and answer any questions that have come up in the meantime. And you're welcome to join me in that. Before I start recording, we'll chat a little bit and I can address questions or we can just chat. And that's all. I hope you have an excellent week with detective fiction. It's not too early to be thinking about what you want to maybe want to write about. So um, take a minute to look at that close reading prompt and think about what's interesting to you as you read through these stories. Have a great week.